Hey folks, it's Nate. Time to go back to the drawing board. Apologize if I sound a little froggy tonight. I'm kind of fighting off a head cold here. Anyway, I just wanted to sit down and knock out a couple videos that relate back to something I heard Narwhal talking about at the end of his latest Writer's Room stream. I thought these might be interesting subjects to discuss with y'all. The first one for this video, I wanted to talk about stealing ideas for fun and profit. Now, this idea came about because Narwhal mentioned with one of the other guys he was streaming with. I'm not sure exactly the context here because I only caught the last 10 minutes of the stream or so. But they were talking about whether they're going to use certain story ideas, it sounded like. And that got me thinking about, how often we creative type people think that everything we think of has to be original and only we have thought of doing it, which is kind of silly because it's very hard to do anything original. Most stories have been told in some form or another. I'm going to give you an example of this from something I've done. I've actually written a novel based on one of the comic book ideas that your boy Zach pitched about a year ago now, more or less. I don't remember the exact pitch, and I haven't been able to find the video where he makes the pitch. But the general gist of the story was that it was a science fiction piece about colonists who were on their way to a star to settle it, only to encounter an alien spacecraft. It was their first contact with aliens. And the alien turned out to be an observer of the human race. And he was an expert in human history and secret human history. And what the people on this colony ship found out was that the history they knew had been carefully altered over a long period of time by the government in an attempt to kind of cut down on conflict. They got rid of all the wars and atrocities from human history to kind of tamp down on racial animosities and class conflicts and things like that. Now, I thought this was a pretty interesting premise for a story, but I had some problems with it. The biggest one was aliens in and of themselves. I mean, this is a very interesting idea about humanity and the things we will do in pursuit of what we think is a better life for ourselves or a better culture to leave to our children. And in that kind of a question, aliens almost feel extraneous. So I was interested in telling a story like that, but I didn't really like his source of conflict. I didn't like the presence of aliens there. Aliens were the alien species were the primary antagonist in his story. I didn't really like that. I wanted it to be a conflict about humans in conflict with other humans. So I took that story and I tweaked it. I kept the essentials that a human government had altered history in an attempt to remove conflict and all the sources of bitterness and racial hatred, things like that. But I got rid of the aliens and I changed the nature of the colonists some. And the result was a book that was nothing like Zach's story. It's about colonists who return to Earth after 200 years out of contact, and they discover that the history of Earth as they know it is completely different from the history of Earth that they discover in circulation when they reach Earth. The civilization is nothing like they expect, and the people who wind up on Earth, quite by accident really, have to work out whether or not what they know as the history is correct, or whether what the people on Earth know as history is correct. And there's a lot of other cultural conflicts and things that go with the story. And so I started with the same basic story idea. I literally got the idea by listening to Zach's pitch. But I wound up with a completely different story, with a completely different conflict. aiming to tell stories with completely different beginnings and endings, with different protagonists and antagonists. So, did I steal Zach's idea? Well, sort of. I mean, it certainly started with his story pitch, but it was also nothing like his story pitch. Zach could still tell his story, and even if we both got it published and copyrighted, there would be no copyright issues whatsoever. Characters don't have the same name. The scenario doesn't have the same name. His story has aliens. Mine doesn't. There's so many differences that it's very easy to see that we're dealing with two different stories. There's a parallel here to actual media. If you know anything about the Witcher series, if you've delved into its history any, you know that it kind of started with a plagiarized work, Elric of Melbaron or something like that. Don't quote me. But the person in the Polish translation office who happened across it was the guy who would then write The Witcher, and there are apparently a lot of similarities between the first novel in the Witcher series and the first novel in the Elric series, and I can't really attest either way to that. I am not familiar with either series of books, but people who are familiar with both generally agree that yes, there are a lot of similarities. However, in later stories, The Witcher and Elric, they just kind of diverge. And if you set aside, the copyright issues with the early work, you would have two completely independent, unrelated fantasy series. Now, obviously, I'm not saying, plagiarize to start with in order to build your own work, although, you always hear about fan fiction writers who manage to eventually get their own publishing careers because people really like their fan fiction. I'm looking at you, E.L. James. Maybe that's not the best role model to have, but you do you can learn techniques that way, and eventually you wind up building your own stories. So how do you build your own stories? Well, going back to the difference between Zach's pitch and my final novel, which I call Schrodinger's book, the very first thing I did was I got rid of the aliens. So right away, that's how I made my first change. I said, I don't want aliens. They seem to cut against, the heart of the story, at least the story as I see it, clearly not the story as Zach saw it. And at the end of the day, that's what makes the difference. How different creators see stories. What is the point of them? Where do you want to put the emphasis? That kind of thing. And so the first change I made was I got rid of aliens, because aliens put the emphasis on the exploring outwards part of the story, which is fine. But I wanted to take a more culturally reflective look at the story. So I turned it into, rather than a civilization or a part of a civilization isolated in space traveling to another planet, I turned it into people who had been isolated returning to a larger civilization, coming back to what was ostensibly their home. And from that, I changed the setting from being a colony ship that runs from the sound of Zach's pitch, much like ships have always run, with a clear command structure and the like, to a very dystopic world with a typical single-party government called Unigov, and with a lot of very peculiar circumstances to it. The human population was much smaller than was expected. Of course, human history was in conflict with what the colonists expected. So there was where Zach's setting was very orthodox and very much what you might expect from a science fiction story. Um, I specifically set out to undercut expectations of what you might see in a sci-fi story, in order to build a sense of um, being out of place, being very discomforted by what you were seeing, and from there, the change in antagonist was very natural. I didn't need aliens. We had Unigov and the representatives of Unigov who were well-meaning on the outside, but rather sinister in the way they acted. And from that, the rest of the story just sort of played itself out naturally. I didn't even have to think about Zach's story from that point going forward. I had a new conflict. I had a new setting. I came up with new characters. I found new exposition beats, new action beats, and I had a completely different story. So yeah, I stole Zach's idea and then I made it my own. And I think when you're looking to tell a story and you hear a story that you really like, and you're like, oh man, I want to tell a story like that, but I don't want to steal this story. All you really have to do is you have to look at it and say, well, where would I put the emphasis? What would I change to make this story suit the kind of stories I like to tell better? Because you're going to like to tell very different stories, most likely, from most of the people who make stories. Like that's one of the great parts about being a creator. It's very much driven by you and your interests and what you like to do, what you don't like to do, your experiences growing, and so when you take these things and you examine a story in light of them, you can then take that story and change it to suit your needs. Now, you don't always change a story as radically as I did. Some stories are iconic or archetypical. The hero's journey, of course, is the most obvious example, and it's the one storytellers talk about the most. But there are other kind of stories, like the rescue story, and this can be anything from saving the princess from a dragon to rescuing people who were kidnapped by Indians in the Old West. There's 101 different iterations of rescuing, a person in trouble that you can do, and you can also, change the nature of the protagonist. You can change the nature of the antagonist and still, keep the settings the same. So don't be afraid to try your hand at telling a story that someone else has told. But at the same time, don't hold that story as the standard for your story. When you're telling your own story, you need to take the elements of the story that most appeal to you and put the emphasis there. And even just doing that can make for an entirely different story. Let me give you an example from Disney. If you've seen the classic Sleeping Beauty, that story, as a matter of fact, almost all fairy tales are told from the perspective of the woman in them. And, all you would have to do to make a really great version of Sleeping Beauty, perhaps, is to change it around and tell it from the man's perspective. What is it like to, go hunting and meet a beautiful woman and suddenly find out she needs to be rescued from an evil witch? A very simple story, but a very different one from the narrative as it's presented in the classic Disney story. So, yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to say is every story has been told already, but it was told by someone else. And when they tell their story, you can look at it and realize, hey, I can tell my story even though it's very similar. And you don't have to be afraid to borrow from that. I'm pretty sure that's not what Narwhal and his co-host was talking about on that stream, but it's what it put in my mind. Some story ideas are, almost all story ideas are very flexible. So don't be afraid to take them and do your own thing with them. I got another video I want to do inspired by that stream. So I'm going to follow that up with this one, but I probably won't post it until tomorrow. So hope you've enjoyed that and that you'll come back tomorrow to hear the next part. Talk to you later.